Hello and welcome to the Digital Insight, the technology and supply chain podcast that delivers valuable C-level perspective into the core issues surrounding business transformation and digital disruption. Each episode will bring you the most inspiring executive insights from those leading transformation strategies within the world's biggest and best-known companies. The Digital Insight. Disrupt, transform, evolve.
Hello and welcome to Digital Insight, the podcast from CPO Strategy and the Interface magazine. Today we're joined by Mike Dargan, Global Head of Technology at the Switzerland-based bank UBS. And Mike will be telling us about the technology transformations going on inside this major banking corporation.
Thanks for joining us, Mike. So can you tell us the 5 pillars to digital transformation that UBS is implementing and how you've been getting them off the ground?
Yeah, so we introduced a framework for innovation or digital transformation, which are really the levers by which we achieve things, which is the ABCDE, which is A for AI and automation, B for unbundling, C for cloud, D for data, and E for experience. So these are really the levers we pull to try and drive the transformation. It's also a good way for people to remember what we're doing and therefore give the right focus to each of the areas.
And can we expand a little bit more on them? I mean, starting with AI, artificial intelligence and automation. I mean, what functions, what business functions is UBS trying to automate?
So I think the first is actually all of these are super linked. So you can only really do this if you've got a cloud strategy because you can operate obviously in the hyperscale environment. Getting the data organized is important. To drive the right experience. And AI and automation is one of the biggest. So we've been focused at first on robotics or robotic process automation and moving along the value chain to try and drive AI, which can come in many different forms. The first is doing it in a very structured way, so almost like a if-then type way, and then moving into machine learning, which can be NLP, natural language processing, and chatbots. So the first area of focus is really in the non-client facing space. So what we're doing in HR to have a chatbot, or what we're doing in technology to have what we call a smart bot, which helps everyone when they have a technology issue. So they can communicate live. If they have an issue, the computer itself will resolve issues and drive things in that way.
So, I mean, that's very interesting. And I think when we think about bank IT, we do tend to think of it as extremely sturdy, reliable, but we also tend to think of it as fairly traditional and slow to react, centered around things like batch processing. When we talk about things like automation or digital transformation, we've tended to think in terms of the FinTech sector. Have there been any specific challenges for UBS in sort of thinking about how we can move what is effectively a grand institution into a digital age?
Yeah, it's a really important point. So UBS has a long heritage. We've obviously got a very big team in technology and spend a lot of money. You do have fintechs who are in a specific area and therefore slightly more nimble. What we're focused on as well is how we drive and be agile in the technology space. And I think agile is one of the most loaded and almost worst words that's used. And it means so many things to so many people that we almost need to reset and think about it slightly differently. So what is agile for us? We want to try and get requirements into production as quickly and as in good quality as possible. So we kicked off last year a process to try and drive up our automated testing. We're now at sort of 60-70%, up from 20-30%. We also kicked off a process to have the right development toolchain process so that we have 3 dev toolchains so that developers can come in and have the right experience from day one. And then it's about the right partnership with the business to ensure that we're working together on things. And we actually had an offsite last week, and we've got 3 or 4 big bets that we want to do in technology. And the first is, how do you create the right dynamic developer engineering experience so that you put as much of the testing experience and activities on the cloud and the development itself, so Jira and Jenkins and GitHub, etc. The second big bet is how do you create a common services ecosystem? So we then have a marketplace for capabilities and services that offers that full spectrum of features that service providers and consumers need. So inventory, discovery, provisioning, orchestration, et cetera, et cetera. So having the best engineering experience for our developers/engineers as possible so that it can be created within what is the ecosystem of UBS.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on the question of terminology. I mean, agile is just the latest of these terms that had a very particular meaning but has spread out a bit like a blancmange since then.
Yep.
But I think typically we've seen after initial enthusiasm and then a little bit of skepticism from developers, they have typically come on board, and most people are at least considering moving certain aspects of the business to a kind of DevOps type framework or something like that.
Yep.
But
yep.
What about the rest of the workforce? And UBS has a particularly large workforce. I mean, are they seeing this as a disruptive process? And in some ways, it must be a disruptive process. So how do you communicate to people that there are net benefits involved?
So I think there's a few aspects to this. So the first is transitioning at least the technology workforce to be engineer focused, etc. So and the culture more broadly. So hiring great talent is something that's been really important. So we created hiring questions, so we go above just vetting the technical competency. So how do they build a strong culture? So someone who's accountable, collaborative, and capable of working within that environment. We also created something called a Distinguished Engineer program, which nurtures great engineering talent across the board. And then the other big focus for me, and especially for me personally, is the right learning program. So we have things focused on emerging technologies and disciplines like machine learning and cloud and data science. And we've signed up with Coursera to offer some of these. For instance, our most popular course at the moment is neural networks and deep learning. And we are spending a lot of time supporting the managers and helping them become better managers through different programs. And it really is learning that I think helps make that step-by-step change. So it's not a scary set of changes, but something that's interesting and, if you like, evolutionary instead of revolutionary for them.
And is learning part of keeping the staff, attracting them in the first place and keeping them? Because IT staff, I'm thinking particularly in the area of security, but it's probably true in other areas as well. It can be very difficult for businesses to attract staff. We have a situation where some professionals are able to kind of demand whatever salary they want. They want a fairly clear and defined career path. And some enterprises aren't able to provide that for them. So, for example, with security, it's been very difficult for people to attract staff.
Yeah, I must say we haven't really had that issue. So we did a lot of hiring last year, partly as we looked to insource and shift away from the sort of vendor-based model that we had the last 2 years. But I think the broader point is technology will continue to evolve, and has been evolving for years, but I think is evolving faster and faster than ever before. So I think the importance of learning and the learning culture is just critical. And it's not just for hiring, it's also just to ensure that people evolving and learning and wanting to be at UBS because we're providing them the right experiences.
And is there a clear way to communicate with staff that they're not just being sent on kind of strange open days? I mean, I think a lot of people have had negative experiences with training in the past, and while they would welcome the opportunity to learn new practical skills that are going to be of use to them, or perhaps open new areas of technology that might future-proof their careers or even lead them into a slightly different area, there is generally a concern that people's time is being wasted. I mean, how do you communicate that to the staff?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. I think, and one that we debate a lot, because I also think people learn in different ways. So I personally learn best by reading. Others learn best by classroom. Others learn best by web-based training. Others learn best actually by YouTube or other things. So we do look at all the different ways you can do this. There are tools which offer, if you like, a sort of portal to enable people to do things in different ways. We do try and make sure there's different tools and mechanisms. I think you also, by definition, can't make learning on broader topics mandatory. We do have some regulatory training which is mandatory, but then also communication in general, I think, is difficult given the size of the workforce. So we do different things. So we do as much communication as possible. We do run workshops, town halls, coffee corners, fireside chats. We do different digital tools. So we do a chat bot actually at the moment called Tell Us, so that people can give direct feedback and people can vote. I actually personally blog a lot. I think it's the simplest and most honest way of getting updates and personal thoughts to the team. And that may be a variety of things, of personal stuff or updates or milestones or strategy or whatever. But other members of the management team do different things, so daily or weekly webcasts or other things.
So going back to the question of agility, in practical terms, what is it you're trying to deliver?
What are we trying to deliver? We have a responsibility to deliver the best possible technology that we can for UBS more broadly, but also the end client. And that can be through waterfall or DevOps or agile or Kanban or whatnot. But we also want to make sure that it's done efficiently and with good quality. And that is, in a nutshell, what agile is. But it also ensures that we evolve the teams and the culture. A good setup today or in the past would have, a program manager and a BA and a quant and a developer and an ops person and et cetera. I think the skill set will become more multivariant and integrated as we move forward. And sort of, you talk more and more about the two pizza rule, that ideally that the size of a team should be that which is which two pizzas can serve. And we drive greater and greater efficiency by getting stuff into production.
If you'll indulge me sort of engaging a little bit of industrial archaeology, so to speak, if you go back through the history of development, particularly internal development for use within business, which is where the majority of software goes, once we got out of the kind of stone age of developments came in like structured programming in the 1980s. It was followed in the late 80s, early 90s by object orientation. And those were met with some resistance at the time, but nonetheless the benefits were clear. And they didn't, although they represented a change in methodology, they didn't represent a complete step change in how things were done. Agile seems to me to be a significantly different way of doing things. Do you think it requires completely new skills and a new way of looking at problems?
To a certain extent, but I think it's also just a different mindset of how things get done. So I think one can get very caught up in what we think about waterfall or agile or the different types of this, but it really is having definition, build and test and release as an iterative process instead of having things that are truly waterfall. So I think it does decrease risk. I think it actually makes the teams from the business and technology more empowered and engaged throughout the process. I think you get better business value with that given velocity, and you can adapt to changing needs as things evolve. So also, to one of your earlier points around stability, I think the time to discover issues is just better, because in a waterfall model, you're sort of doing initiate to analyze, to plan, to build, to test, to release, and doing whatever that may be, monthly or quarterly releases. And in some areas, that's the right thing to do. But in other areas, I'd rather have sort of a defined build, test, release, iterative approach as much as possible.
A lot of the people I've spoken to about Agile and so on have said that one of their main objectives is to get away from this kind of large 2-3 year grant project that often produces a kind of mission creep scenario or perhaps a giant blob of code that no one can really understand. So with Agile, I guess the idea is to break things down to their smallest practical level. Is that how UBS is working?
Yes, although what I would say is I think it happens in both methodologies. So if you have a long project, by definition, it's easier to have scope creep and issues and budget overrun and whatnot. You can still have in a longer project where you know it's going to be multi-year, defined 3 or 6 month milestones. So instead of waiting until 3 years ex post, you do put defined sets of milestones or pre-release of code every 3 to 6 months. Now, in the agile model, that would be even shorter. But under any scenario, we want to make sure that we do this so that you've got defined sets of milestones every X months, just to make sure that we're more honest with ourselves of what's being done.
And finally, I'm sure every business would say that their business is important and what they do is important, and no doubt it is to the people in the business and to their customers. But I think with finance and banking, I think we can agree that the stakes are pretty high. Has that changed your approach? Does that not tend toward a certain conservatism?
Yes, we would never risk regulatory releases or client releases. So will we move to 100% agile /DevOps? Absolutely not. There are certain things that we need to do with the right definition, the right analysis, etc. But there are still areas which it's appropriate and makes sense to move more and more to an iterative model. And that iterative model can take different forms, even in the waterfall space. So is the regulatory stringency and client requirement high in banking? Absolutely, and it's something we would never, ever dilute, but it can be still done in a more efficient and expedient way.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for this.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Insight Podcast in association with theinterface.net and cpostrategy.com. The Digital Insight is brought to you by B2E Media Limited. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review, and don't forget to check out our podcast archive at www.b2e-media.com/podcast.